I Hate the News is the weekly news bulletin from I Hate Politics podcast, a show about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. It's January 6th, 2026. We pride ourselves in taking the worm's eye view of things, staying local, small, and deliberately at the edge of the tidal waves of national and international politics. But sometimes, like today, we get swept into the sea. How do we keep talking about the school board, county council, or road safety when the Trump administration has decided that it is within the law and acceptable to go into another country to snatch its head of state and then pretend to prosecute him under US law? And for the courts to look like they would agree with this crazy notion. The list of countries the United States has intervened in militarily, covertly, harmfully is a long one. But even in that infamous list, there is one and only one case in the last 250 years when the United States invaded and captured another head of state to try them in American courts. That was Manuel Noriega of Panama, who in 1989 was given the same treatment by then President George H.W. Bush. Bush 1. There are differences in the Noriega and Maduro cases, but their similarity will lie in the figment of jurisdiction U.S. courts are likely to find to allow the prosecution of the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to proceed. The final denouement, who knows? Noriega spent 2 decades in U.S. prisons, was sent to France, and finally to Panama, where he died in 2017. This episode raises questions not just about the international dimensions of Trump's authoritarianism, but the much longer specter of extraterritoriality of U.S. law, promoted, it should be pointed out, by the left and the right. Spain claims universal application of its laws. Could they try this someday? Maybe against a nation smaller than themselves. Russia and China are dictatorships. China is the biggest supplier of fentanyl precursor chemicals to the US. Would the US try this someday against a peer competitor? Today also marks the 5-year anniversary of the 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters. And given everything, we decided to jettison our normal radio-style multiple-segment Tuesday News Bulletin we cheekily call I Hate the News for a discussion about the Maduro affair with Cato Institute Senior Fellow Walter Olson. It is not a small decision for us. This is the 100th episode of the Tuesday News Show. The Friday shows are now at episode 267. I'd rather be talking about the school board, county council, and road safety. But here we are with a bird's eye view. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
You're still on to me when I'm alone, and then I start to feel it creeping up inside. I told myself that this was the last time. I think I'm losing my mind.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County native and now DC-based singer-songwriter Kara Levchenko's 2 new single releases, Animal and Cosmic Love. You can find her and her music at karalevchenko.com.
The way I'm out too long, you think I feel so criminal. I sense you clearing from a distance, it's disturbing. No, maybe I'm talking like an animal. You're so suffocating, let me go. Oh, wow. The way I'm out too
Walter Olson, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. Glad to join you.
The U.S. has taken Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and his wife, Celia Flores, and they will face drug trafficking charges in the United States. That's extraordinary in many ways. Let's talk about the legality of this before we talk about the politics.
There's international law, and I'm not going to talk much about that because I don't think it's going to matter very much for what happens in coming months. And then there's domestic law. The watershed was the Noriega incident because American courts had long taken the view, and it was an outgrowth of the law in England and many other places, that courts cannot try a foreign head of state. It was a pretty hard and fast rule. And yet they did try Noriega. And when the American administration insisted that they do so, they thought about it and they said, oh, I guess you must be right. The fancy footwork executed on that is going to be done again. Maduro is not going to win on this stage of the case, whether or not they have jurisdiction to try him. They said, head of state, Noriega, just because he was giving orders to the Panamanian military, just because the Panamanian bureaucracy, et cetera, all this list of things that would ordinarily define a head of state in practical terms, they said, but we didn't recognize. People point out that there were other differences in the Noriega case, that Noriega had his parliament declare war on the U.S. and that a Marine had been shot. Those are probably of relevance for the international law side, but they are not relevant to the question of whether American courts will create a very notable exception for people who look like heads of state, walk and talk like heads of state, but who the U.S. doesn't recognize as heads of state. That's what they're doing with Maduro. They're saying maybe he was legitimate head of state up until he stole the election. You may notice, by the way, that the Trump administration has been very, very careful about not bringing in the stolen election issue very much. Nonetheless, there's no doubt that at one point, around the time that Maduro stole the election, much of the world withdrew their designation of him as in any way a legitimate ruler. With the U.S. already not recognizing him, it's probably going to be a pretty routine application of we did it to Noriega and we're going to do it again here.
If the rest of the world decides not to cooperate with the United States in validating that, then what?
My prediction stands. There are ways in which even this Supreme Court pays some attention to international law. Yet, the deference which many different courts of many different compositions have given to national security assertions is surely close to its zenith for our lifetime now. When it is a matter of deciding some property lawsuit, even this court would probably often be willing to nod at international law. But the closer it gets to what they see as the separation of powers dangers of treading on a core presidential power in an area where the court's expertise is at their minimum, I'm practically reciting the sorts of language that they might resort to, then this particular court, and I'm not going to talk about the Warren court, but this particular court is going to find a way to defer.
So what happens to Maduro next?
He has other cards in his hand besides the "you have no right to try me." In the superseding indictment, so-called, that they just issued, but also in the earlier indictment of a few years ago that had been hanging for several years, he was accused of improper gun possession. I have to think with all that the Supreme Court has done to roll back the idea that the government can properly regulate guns unless it was regulating them in that way during the founding era. The founders, I feel sure, would absolutely have turned somersaults rather than think that they could apply gun law extraterritorially to what people were doing in Caracas, Venezuela.
What happens to the drug trafficking charges?
Remember, they get a lot of drug convictions and drug conspiracy trafficking convictions. So this is something the U.S. government and the courts are both very comfortable with from long, long application. And that doesn't mean, again, that the government wins every case. Courts do scrutinize whether or not actions are coordinated enough to count as conspiracy, whether what the state of mind was of various players. We don't know all of the evidence that the U.S. government is likely to present.
By that measure, you could go after the junta in Burma.
Trump himself has asserted that the national policies of Canada, for Pete's sake, and many, many other countries are criminally negligent in not whatever it is that he wants people to do to keep the traces of fentanyl from being smuggled from Canada. Trump has pre-set up the idea that it isn't just Maduro, that anyone exerts sovereignty and therefore has to constantly deal with shady characters as sovereignties do. There's lots of ways of asserting complicity, and you would expect that even with the national security deference, even with the view of heads of state, that the courts would still apply some sort of filter of, wait a minute, heads of state have to be expected to do a certain amount of trade-offs about how much to crack down when law enforcement money has to be spent on other things too. Since Trump has himself invoked this as a reason to be hostile toward many countries that are more well affected toward us than Venezuela, where does this lead? More than one person joked that if Putin had only accused Vladimir Zelensky of being soft on drug smuggling, that he could already be in Kiev. Every major invasion, certainly including the ones in 1939, has involved the citation or manufacture outrages committed by the weaker and smaller parties that were being invaded. Putin has a list of these against Estonia, against Latvia, against countries that are far tinier than it would take to pose much of a military threat, and yet he has long lists of alleged aggressions that they've committed.
And Trump himself pardoned the former 100 president.
Oh, you noticed that, didn't you? When I wrote my piece yesterday, what I finally wound up making the theme is these rationales are shifting so fast that you can't pin them down for more than a few hours at a time. Trump announced that we were going to run Venezuela, and then the collective sharp intake of breath was such that Marco Rubio came out the next day and said, well, let me clarify that. We're actually not going to be running Venezuela. J.D. Vance said that in addition to drug smuggling, it was about stolen oil. That's what he said in his initial rationale on social media after the first reports. And then the indictment comes out and it doesn't say anything about oil. Oil is not, in fact, anywhere in the law enforcement rationale. So you've got the law enforcement rationale, the national security rationale, which would not necessarily involve the Justice Department. You've got the so-called Monroe Doctrine or Don Roe Doctrine. And that's worth talking about a bit too, because junior defenders of MAGA out there are saying, gee, haven't you ever heard of the Monroe Doctrine? Of course he has the right to do this. If we could bring President James Monroe back from the dead and John Quincy Adams, they would certainly not have interpreted it as a blank check to invade any country that the U.S. is mad at in the Western Hemisphere. So all of these rationales keep on as in a lava lamp. You think you've got a recognizable pattern, and then it kind of disappears and something else comes up in front instead.
In the rest of the world, and I read some of the media from everywhere else, everybody believes this is about oil.
Oil is kind of enigmatic here because it clearly occupies a big space in Trump's mind. Whether it occupies as big a space in the mind of some of the other actors like Marco Rubio is not as clear. And I'm also not convinced that it's the old, people used to call it vulgar Marxist, the idea that someone in the executive offices of an oil company decided that we would overthrow Maduro. It's pretty clearly didn't happen that way. Stories are now coming out, Washington Post and elsewhere, of Trump's relationships with major oil companies in this. And one of the striking things is that he was on the phone telling them that this would happen and asking their advice before it happened, when he wasn't on the phone with Congress, with some major Republican committee chairs, let alone all the Democrats. When he talked to them, he offered them what some of them considered a pretty bad deal, which is, some of them have these hanging adjudications that they're entitled to money from the expropriation way back in the 1970s, that Venezuela still owes the money. And so you can just imagine how those conversations went. The oil CEO may have said, hey, does this mean that we finally get to cash in that check that courts have said we've owed for decades? And Trump said, no, I'm not going to let you get that money unless you come in with massive new investments, because he wants control of the Venezuelan oil fields. And if no capital is forthcoming because the oil companies have taken their money and left or can't negotiate with Dulce Rodriguez or whatever, then Trump's control of the oil fields is going to be of no use to him. So he wants genuine working control of the oil fields, and not necessarily just so that he can give a member of the Trump family some of the proceeds, although it would not, I must say, cause me to fall over in a faint if it turned out that also happened, but because because Trump sees himself as this player on the world chessboard, and Venezuela's oil is to him the main asset, the main reason to pay attention to that country. Now, some people who watch the energy industry say that his thinking, imagine Trump's thinking being 50 years out of date on something, but that Trump's thinking dates back to a point at which much less oil had been discovered. Venezuela's relatively low quality, so-called dirty oil, was the best that people had, and that the fact that China imports a lot of it was a very crucial thing in whether or not China could make it in the world. Well, times have changed. There's many more sources of oil, that many of them are considered more desirable. It's one of the reasons Venezuelan oil industry has gone into a tailspin, another being terrible management from the Chavez Maduro folks. So Trump may not realize how different the energy world of 2026 is from what he grew up with. Nonetheless, that these things are gyrating in his mind, to use the phrase from Pirates of Penzance.
He is not going to be able to bring the world price of oil down significantly by adding Venezuela's production, even extended production to the oil.
Well, it would take years as far as production. Now, if the markets were convinced that he was going to successfully do that, they would probably anticipate some price cuts. The ego there is not a purely monetarily fed ego. I was shocked by this morning's Washington Post. One of the angles that I had followed with great interest is Trump's kicking to the curb Maria Corina Machado, and she had been kicked off the ballot by the Maduro people, and her party had agreed to run a much less well-known person who nonetheless got 2/3 of the vote, won by 37 points or so, according to independent observers. So the natural question would be, especially after she won the Nobel Peace Prize, she's probably the logical place to turn for a next regime. Well, so Trump kicked her to the curb in his first press conference, even though Machado has been extravagantly pro-American, very pro-business and free enterprise. No reason whatsoever to think that Machado would not be kind of a best case as far as giving fair terms to American oil companies that might want to come in and revive the Venezuelan industry. So given that that motive might be at its zenith for saying, come on in, Maria. Why does he kick her to the curb? Well, I reserve judgment thinking, okay, maybe there's some national security thing that I don't know. And then out comes this morning's Washington Post, quoting two people close to the president, saying, yeah, it was because he was jealous of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he thought that she should turn it down because he deserved it. And instead, she accepted it, but dedicated it to him, and that wasn't good enough for him. So he's been mad at her ever since. And if she had just turned it down, she would be president of Venezuela today.
I imagine that if Machado were to take leadership, that it would precipitate a civil war very quickly, because it's not like Maduro regime doesn't have street power. In a weird way, having Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, be the temporary heir apparent, suggests that keep a structure in place while you try to figure it out.
You can interpret the actions so far as stemming from a couple of different motivations. And one of them is the one that you just said, which is that people believe that he just wants to avoid civil war. That's the best case interpretation of what he did. Even on that, I would be a little surprised at his wording of his dismissiveness of Machado, because I would think that he would want to be more non-committal on the hope that some of her people might get into a coalition government. But instead, it was, see you around, lady. The other possibility, though, which I do not at all rule out, and which is believed by some of the people close to the negotiations, is that he is not going to insist on a transition in which Rodriguez then gives up power to some coalition that is closer to the center of Venezuelan public opinion, but that he sees her as potentially long-term, having turned her to American ends and gotten her to be dependent of American power, leaves Chavismo in place, leaves the lack of free elections in place. This all sounds like villainous imputation, motives to impute to an American president. On the other hand, we kind of know what he thinks about stolen elections, don't we?
So when we say regime change, we mean removal of an entire regime itself. So everybody associated. But this is maybe just a leadership change, a coup d'etat, in fact.
Yeah, someone described this as shaping up as potentially just a coup rather than a regime change, in which the less compliant Maduro is replaced with the more compliant Rodriguez. And part of the coverage over the weekend, I think the New York Times had, is that Qatar was the intermediary and that Rodriguez, who apparently has stashed a lot of her secret money in Qatar anyway, and various Trump figures all have close relationships with Qatar. In the negotiations that have been taking place for weeks, Rodriguez, with Maduro's consent, which is interesting, has been portraying herself and her circle as the softer, yet Madurismo without Maduro that could lead to a fresh start in U.S. relations. Combined with the view that she had a more successful managerial run in the Venezuelan oil industry than her predecessor had, this was enough to make them think, okay, she's the one that we can deal with.
All of this, does it mean that, the traditional oil and regime change Iraq formula that is often trotted out needs to be rethought? I mean, it seems like both oil and regime change don't mean the same thing to Trump as they mean to, say, George W.
Right. And with George W., obviously, there was still that holdover of we're going to democratize the world, which is so totally absent. Call it perverted idealism or call it whatever kind of idealism. There was a very genuine, and you certainly could see it in the staffing of the Bush administration. So that's absent. That has been systematically stamped out. The idea that improving or even just Americanizing institutions is itself worth working for.
I've been thinking then of the tension between neoliberalism and realism in foreign policy and how that tension is playing out.
I'm going to reinterpret your question as what is the underlying foreign policy posture, and is it just realism or is it other things too? And I think it's other things too. I interpret realism to some extent as the absence of something rather than the presence of something. It is the absence of certain overlaying idealistic motivations that for quite a few decades were assumed to be if not the complete theme, then one of the major themes of American policy was to do good in various ways, and that realism consists of withdrawing partially or entirely those altruistic motivations which might not play into national interest. The realism that is left over is realism that you can associate with Richard Nixon. Trump brings something additional to it. Trump has a real internationalism in that he cares deeply whether or not far-right anti-immigration parties win in countries like Germany and France and England. He cares about whether or not Bolsonaro wins in Brazil. Now, some of that, of course, could be a realistic calculation that Brazil would be a very useful ally to have. But part of it, I'm convinced, goes beyond that. It's that it's like a nationalist international, if that's not too, if that phrase doesn't collapse from self-contradiction. He sees kindred spirits. He believes that, for example, if Alternative for Deutschland comes to power in Germany at some point, even though it has had its share of anti-American figures, and some of its people have preached anti-American policy, particularly when we were more at odds with Russia, that he will calculate that they will not strictly weigh German national self-interest. The fellow feeling between them, the fact that they are both part of some sort of international, quote, movement, unquote, together, will in fact pull them into cooperation in a way not explained entirely by American or German self-interest. Should we be horrified? I actually think, yes, we should be horrified. But it's idealism. It's Trump's own poisoned flower kind of idealism, just sacrificing certain types of short-term American interests for the sheer aesthetic appreciation of seeing an authoritarian regime bloom where there had once been a democratic one.
There is a larger question here that I've been thinking about, which is the extraterritoriality, particularly of U.S. law. Where do you see that? How is that developing?
This has been not a problem just with Trump. This has been growing over many administrations and for many reasons and with many different fans cheering it. International law, where it is most accepted and most legitimate, includes the push toward extraterritoriality of American law has drawn from advocates of business regulation who want to get at antitrust offenses that occur in Europe. It has drawn on environmentalists who believe that you should be able able to sue a Dutch oil company for what it's doing in Indonesia, in San Francisco. But very, very significantly, it is the drug war that has, with the approval of both political parties, caused America to step into the role of policeman to the world. Even before we were murdering the crews of the little boats in the Caribbean, it was accepted by both parties that at least we could stop and search the boats, admittedly a milder sanction, but nonetheless one that was not necessarily accepted by older international law. But the American drug war tends to chew up and revamp all sorts of old areas of law, international included.
In domestic politics, then, what do you think the impact of this is? Is this a cudgel that the Democratic Party could pick up, or does it look like another weak tomato sauce they can throw at the administration?
Trump has chosen his outrages very carefully, even though there is not very good evidence that his sending troops into cities actually is going to do much about crime rates, which are dropping in the cities where he doesn't do it, just as they are in the cities where he does do it, because crime's dropping. He knows the issues to pick to create the impression that his opponents are soft on X, soft on crime, soft on social services fraud, soft on this one. I have to say, many people very critical of the Trump administration are hailing as an advance for American national interests to get rid of one of the two major hostile regimes in the hemisphere. And of course, if he does it to Cuba, he is going to be floating along on a great deal of gratitude from people who may not be particularly political and may not be particularly pro-Trump, but have their own reasons for being very angry at the Castro regime.
You mean Cubans in Florida?
Including Cubans in Florida, but including a whole lot of other people too, because the oppression in Cuba, the things that it has done to free thought, gay people, to many, many others, are widely known way, way beyond the expatriate community. And it shows, in one sense, why the version of international law that kind of was solemnized after World War II, in which invasion of another country is the chief offense, in which the chief thing the international order was set up to stop was invasions of other countries. But if you succeed in doing that, then Cuba can stay unmolested despite every horrible thing it does.
Which begs the question, why Venezuela and not Cuba?
Well, it's a good question. And, part of the answer is probably as simple as that Maduro was defiant, whereas Cuba seems to be trying to keep quiet. Cynics would say it's because Cuba barely has a drop of oil and Venezuela has tons of it. Again, I'm not convinced that oil alone explains these things. And third, I think Cuba clearly has a more porcupine-like military setup, which would inflict more casualties. Who was not surprised that America did not suffer a single casualty, as it not only took Maduro, but also bombed or otherwise took action against 4 or 5 other major military targets in Caracas.
Who knows how Delcy Rodriguez, why she's doing what she's doing?
Even if Delcy Rodriguez can count on the loyalty of the military, and I don't know about that, she can no longer, as she might have thought she could 4 days ago, count on the competence of the military. So in many ways, Rodriguez is in a weak position because Venezuela has been militarily humiliated in such a way that many people in the Venezuelan military must be wondering if there is a future in what they would assume would be the career path of, be influential in the military and you can be on top of Venezuela. Well, if the country is going to witness what just happened, maybe the military will be more split than it used to be. Maybe the military will not receive as automatic a respect as it would have.
Walter Olson, thank you for taking the time to explain an evolving situation.
Oh, thank you so much.
I don't care if silence playing games today, but it ain't fair. The thought of you takes me away. Now I need air. Yeah, I think I got lost in my head again.
That's all for this episode. Be sure to check out our feature interview series that comes out Friday mornings. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities of Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County native and now DC-based singer-songwriter Kara Levchenko's two new single releases, Animal and Cosmic Love. You can find her and her music at karalevchenko.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Can't read the signs, it feels like perfect timing. Got this love is shining. Pardon me, it feels like we can use a little tea.